Hello everyone, and welcome to FECast, episode 21. I am your host, Sunyveil, and it is just me tonight. Everyone else is busy preparing for the upcoming ECQ. Today's episode is pretty much just going to be focused on the ECQ that is happening this weekend. I am recording this on the eve of the preliminary rounds of the ECQ. That's going to start in about 9 hours from this recording. So I'm going to do my best to get you caught up to speed with everything going on in Expedition and the pillars of the format and how you should tackle it going into the tournament. But first, I would like to give a big shout out to our patrons at patreon.com. If you would like to support FECast and Friends of Eternal, you can head on over to www.patreon.com/Friends of Eternal and support us. If you do, I will be extremely appreciative of you, as I am to these fine folk. So a huge shout out to Yeast Out, D-Dub, Chamomilk, Work Done Son, and Chrissier for their support of FECast and Friends of Eternal. Alright, let's get straight into the tournament analysis. Leading into the tournament, I think there are 3 big decks that you really have to be aware of, consider playing. These are the 3 decks that I expect to do the best in this tournament. And the first one is what has warped the entire format around it, and that is Grownup Strangers. If you asked me 3 days ago, I would have said that this deck was just going to totally dominate the tournament. It was doing extremely well for me in my own tournament preparations, but I think that the metagame has finally adapted to face it. And by the way, all these deck lists are on Warcry. I have links to them in the description of this. You can check out my builds. They're a little different from the builds out there, as my builds typically are, but I have pretty good confidence in all 3 of these. Anyway, so for those of you who don't know, the Stranger deck is, well, it's mostly a ramp deck. You play a lot of Accelerants, High Prophet of Soul, Power Stone, Crack the Earth, which is the time market card that creates a cultist, and then you have Arc of Soul in the market, which you can bargain out if you hit your opponent with a cultist. There's also Magnificent Stranger, which does its best impression of Accelerant. If it gets an attack off, it will reduce the cost of the top card of your deck by 2. You've also got Journey Guide, and Journey Guide is the most contested card, I would say, in this. It is slightly questionable. I think it's good enough to warrant its inclusion. I think it just speeds up the deck enough. And what's the deck trying to ramp to? Well, you've got 4 copies of Grownup Strangers and 4 copies of Traver's Farm to go find that Grownup Stranger. So, I mean, it's got a pretty straightforward game plan. You ramp on 2, you ramp on 3, then you play Grownup Stranger. For anyone listening that doesn't already know what Grownup Stranger does, it's the big 6/6 for 6 Stranger. Whenever a player plays a Stranger, they put a sigil from their deck into play. It also has the text, when Grownup Stranger attacks, shuffle a void into a player's deck and draw 2 cards. The draw 2 cards is the big part of it. So if you get to attack with Grownup Stranger, you generally get to pull ahead, and if it gets removed on site, you still got that value of getting that 1 power. So this deck plays 8 copies of Grownup Stranger. It's also got 4 Nahid's Distillation, that's the draw 3 cards for 6, in order to try to put all that power to good use to refill the hand. Now, I mentioned Crack the Earth earlier. I'm playing a 5-cost market because of that. We've got Grodov's Burden, Makar's Stranger, Marsh Dragon, and Oblivion Spike. Makar's Stranger sees play in the main deck of a lot of these Strangers deck, but I really don't like it. I think that, generally speaking, it's worse than Grodov's Stranger, and there aren't a ton of cards that cost 5 that you really want to be putting in your market, so Makar's Stranger is a nice inclusion there. One weird thing is that you can't get it out of the market when you have Traver's Farm in play, because then it only costs 4. In any case, one of the big weaknesses of this deck leading into this week was that it was weak to flyers, and decks like Dragons and Unseen was just crushing it. But the inclusion of Marsh Dragon in the market, that's that draft card that says, it's a 3/1 that says summon, you may sacrifice a unit to give this plus health and give yourself plus health equal to the number of units in your void. So if you have 5 units in the void, you get a 3/6 and you gain 5 life. Against any deck that's trying to fly over you, that's a pretty big deal. And the other big inclusion is Rectifier. Now Rectifier, another card that you might not expect to see in Constructed. It's a 2/1 cultist for 3, says that when you play it, you get to silence something, and it also has Corrupted for some reason. That's been a really big part of this Xenon deck, and it's really shored up a lot of the weaknesses that the deck has. Alright, so we've got our game plan of slamming the Grownup Stranger on 6. We've got our defenses with Rectifier, Marsh Dragon in the market to deal with flyers, and then we've got some removal and Defile and Banish. A lot of people like pairing Predator's Instinct with Grownup Stranger, and yes, that is extremely powerful. The reason why I don't love having a ton of Predator's Instinct or trying to have other top-end cards, I've seen the Locket, I forget the name of it, but it's a 6-cost weapon that has Spellcraft to play the Witching Hour. Pale Rider's Locket, I believe. The reason why I don't really like that is because in order to play those cards effectively, you need to land a Grownup Stranger anyway. And one problem with ramp decks is if you draw too many ramp targets, too many things that you're trying to ramp into, and you don't have enough to bridge you to that. And I think that is, well, that's how this deck can fail. Those are situations in which this deck is not able to enact its game plan and just doesn't really do much, is if you get stuck on power before you're able to play your Grownup Stranger. And I think that those types of cards, Predator's Instinct, Pale Raiders Locket, even Makar Stranger, if you have multiple Makar Stranger in the main deck, I feel like they're all still just dependent on getting that Grownup Stranger first. So this build of the deck, at the very least, is focusing on Grownup Stranger. Now, this deck is, I think this is warping the metagame, and the reason why it's warping the metagame is because it's really difficult to keep this deck down. If you're trying to control this deck, I don't think that you can do that, and that's why I don't think control is a good choice for this weekend. So this deck's game plan in the late game ends up being you have a ton of power from playing Grownup Stranger and High Profit. And with all that power, what you can do is you can either use Growdov's Burden in order to just draw a card, draw multiple cards every turn if you have enough power against a deck that isn't putting pressure on you, or you can use Strange Navigator, which has the ability pay 9 and exhaust this, draw 5 cards from your void. If you're playing a deck that's playing sweepers and you just have 2 Strange Navigators, you can just loop them by playing one out and playing a bunch of units. Then if they sweep, you play the second Strange Navigator and you draw all the cards back from your void, and all of a sudden, well, you just drew 5 cards. So yes, there are ways for control decks to counter that or to combat that by decimating Shenron Speaks, for example, but I think it's such an uphill battle for control decks that this deck is basically shoving any of those decks that look to play a late game out, I think. And this also preys upon any sort of deck that doesn't have a very efficient game plan. And when we look at the other 2 decks that I think are going to be big players in the metagame, we're going to see that they do have very efficient game plans and they're able to stand toe-to-toe with this Stranger's deck. So we have the Xenon Stranger deck. It's a ramp deck. It's very powerful. It puts a lot of pressure on the decks in the format to either be streamlined or die, I suppose. It's going to get its Grownup Stranger out, and once that happens, this deck's going to take over the game. I think it's still a reasonable choice for the weekend. It's definitely going to mow down all the chaff. If people bring untuned deck lists or decks that just aren't thinking about Grownup Stranger, I think that this is going to be able to mow them down, but I feel like it will struggle against Dragons and against Unseen. Alright, speaking of Unseen, let's talk about that deck. There are a couple versions of Unseen going out there. There are some versions that have 3 factions, and I think those are all bad. There's the Argenport version, which was the highly represented version at the last, I guess it wasn't an ECQ, but the Spring Quarterly Challenge. And I think that that's still the best version of the deck. We'll talk about differences between Combray and Elysian Unseen in a bit, but I think that the Argenport version is still the best. So this Argenport Unseen deck, it's pretty unique as far as decks in Eternal's history go. It uses Outcast Elite, which is a 2/1 Unseen. It has Aegis. When you play another Unseen, it gets a random battle skill. You're hoping to play that on 2, maybe a Bisma Revered Elder on 3. Bisma says, when you play another Unseen, Bisma gets a random battle skill, and you use cards that depend on the number of battle skills you have, like Unseen Commando, which is a 3-cost 2/3 flyer, has flying lifesteal. When your units with 2 or more battle skills attack, they get +1/+1 this turn. And Master's Blade, which is a weapon that says +1/+1 for each of the wielder's battle skills. Spellcraft 1, play Fall Short. It uses the battle skills to give Well, sometimes the battle skills are very relevant, like if you get Flying or Aegis or Exalted, those are usually very relevant battle skills, but even if they aren't, just because you're accumulating them, you get some power with cards like Unseen Commando, Master's Blade, even Bisma. Like, eventually, if you roll enough battle skills off Bisma, then you're going to roll the ones that are relevant. You complement this with some pump spells, Finest Hour, Spiteful Strike, and people like playing Fearless Crescendo in this deck. That's the Justice Market card that gives flying. I'm not actually a huge fan. I think that just having one might be reasonable, but any draw that has multiple, well, if you draw them at the same time, you can market one away, but I don't think Unseen players want to be playing multiple Fearless Crescendos in the same game. So I think the deck runs fine, especially with emblems. I think it runs fine without having any market. You have enough flood protection in just your emblems. So I don't really want to spend an entire card on Fearless Crescendo. I like just playing the other pump spells. And yeah, I mean, you've just got a bunch of really cheap units. They work well together. They get buffed up by your pump spells and Master's Blade, and you just attack. Now, this deck definitely has a reputation for being high rolly, and that's totally understood. I mean, it it can definitely just go Outcast Elite into like Rilgan's Disciple with charge and, I don't know, you attack with it, and then you get to Finest Hour and blow something out. I don't know. There are so many situations that can happen where this deck just rolls over another deck, and it just feels like it's a total luck-based thing, and it definitely is. But I think that this deck is still very powerful. I don't think it's just the high roll potential. I think that it's a very solid deck. It uses cheap units that, if your opponent uses removal on them, you're not out a lot of power. It has evasion in Unseen Commando, and you can also give unblockable with cards like Vara's Intervention, and you might just roll unblockable with some of the cards. And yeah, I think that this might even be the deck that I'm going to be bringing to the tournament. It's definitely the front runner for me, especially with some of the changes I made. One card that people have been picking up on lately, which they definitely should be playing, is Willbreaker. That is the another draft card. It's a 1/2 double damage for 2. It's an unseen summon. Play a -1 attack curse on each enemy unit with flying, corrupted 3. This does a few cool things. First of all, it's just a 1/2 double damage. If you get a random battle skill with it, and it has 2 battle skills, then all of a sudden it gets pumped up by Unseen Commando, and that it can attack for a lot. Also works well with the pump spells. It's corrupted is actually like kind of interesting in that if you have a Bisma out, it accumulates more battle skills because the corrupted unit that comes back, the 0/2, is an unseen, so it triggers Bisma an additional time. So I think this is a must include in the unseen decks. I took out the Switchblade. I think it's called a Switchblade. It's the Shadow 2-cost 2/1. Gets +2/+2 as long as you have battle skill. I also took out Tranquil Scholar, which is, I think Tranquil Scholar was the card that was really bad, and without Tranquil Scholar, I don't think Switchblade is very good. So I took those 2 out. I'm playing 2 Kira right now. Not sure. I still need to work on it. Nice thing about Kira is that you can keep the unblockable from Vara's Intervention. And I think the reason to be playing Shadow are 2 cards. One is Cast into Shadow, which is an exceptional removal spell that it just isn't seeing a ton of play right now. That is, of course, kill an enemy unit or curse with a single faction, and decimate, you get to kill an additional one. And Vara's Intervention is a pretty interesting one that got buffed a while ago and hasn't really seen a ton of play since it got buffed, but it's pretty good. It's a 1-cost spell. Give an enemy unit -2 health, or give one of your units unblockable this turn, or draw an unseen from your void. In this deck, all of your units are unseen, and they retain, well, some of them retain battle skills that they may have accumulated, so it's a nice little last chance, I guess. It doesn't give +1, so it's not quite Dark Return, but the recursion can be really useful. It can even be used as removal. I mean, it kills basically everything that Blazing Salvo kills. And then, of course, giving unblockable to something with double damage and throwing a pump spell on it is very powerful. I think that this is going to be a big player this weekend, and like I said, I might end up playing this, so I just think that this is one of the most powerful decks in the format. There's also a Combre version running around, which I don't think think is quite as good. In Cambrai, you get Armory's Choice, which is the +3/+3 and Overwhelm for 2, and that's definitely a good card in this, but how much better is it than Spiteful Strike? And you don't, like, balancing Amory's Choice versus Spiteful Strike, Vara's Intervention, and Cast into Shadow just doesn't seem worth it. I've seen people play Resolute Monk also, that's the 3-1 that has Empower, gets +2/+2, and Overwhelm, and yeah, like, I think it's fine, but I think just sticking to the unseen synergies is just incredibly powerful and just has such explosive potential if you manage to roll the right battle skills. Obviously, that's not going to happen all the time, but it is so unstoppable when it does. Now, there are a few other Argenport decks running around, some that like halfway go into Unseen, or some that are just playing Bartholo, which is the 2/2 Aegis Unblockable, and I just don't think they're quite as good as this Argenport Unseen deck. I certainly think that going up to Tavrod is a mistake. If you're playing Tavrod, you're playing like suboptimal units, and you're usually playing expensive weapons, and this format is just so fast and so synergy driven that trying to play expensive unit, expensive weapon on the unit, I think is not a great plan. I don't think it's a great place to be. So if you're thinking about playing Argenport, I would definitely say play Unseen instead of some sort of mid-range deck. I do think Impending Doom is pretty good right now, but yeah, I think I'm just playing Unseen. All right, let's go on to the last of the big decks that I expect to see this weekend in this ECQ, and that is Dragons. There are 2 versions of Dragons that I think are pretty popular, although there could be 3 theoretically. There's Skycrag, there's Menace, which is Fire, Shadow, and Primal, and I think that even Stonescar Dragons might have some real potential, and we'll talk about the draws to them in a bit, but let's just go over Skycrag Dragons because it's the most straightforward. This is an aggro deck. It's looking to fly over, which is what makes it good against Grownup Stranger. All these decks, this deck and the last one, they both have a lot of evasion, and I think that's necessary to deal with Grownup Stranger's decks, most notably the Xenon deck, which I think is just limiting the other decks that you can play in the format. So this deck, it's basically what you'd expect out of a Dragons deck. You've got Kozin, Acidonis, Crimson Firemaw, Eclipse Dragon. I have Cloud Snake Harrier in this list, which is, it gives plus spell damage, which is nice with Cinder Clutch, and it's also a 3/3 flyer, so that's pretty good. But you could definitely have Burning Core Drake or something like Dragonforge in it. I think that Dragonforge just generally slows these decks down, which is why I'm not a huge fan of it. Sure, when you have Eclipse Dragon and you get the +3 power, it's fantastic. Like, free selection, a little bit of acceleration for when you play the Dragonforge. It reduces the cost of your next play. And that's really good, but when you don't have the Eclipse Dragon, I feel like it can be a little clunky. One big inclusion of this deck is Tota Pioneer. This is a 1/2 Totemite for 2. When you draw your second card in a turn, you get +2 power this turn, and that's pretty good. That lets you turbo out some of your plays, and that can be a big deal. Like, maybe you play Kozin on turn 3, and then on turn 4 you play Crimson Firemaw. You get the +2 power immediately. You get to play a Seer or something, or you can just draw a card right then and there. And it also has pay for to give one of your other units +4 attack and Overwhelm this turn. Good flood insurance. I think that this is a very good card in certain Dragons decks that specifically can draw 2 cards in a turn. And you have a lot of ways of drawing 2 cards. This version that I'm looking at right now doesn't have Tattoo Dragon, but that's another card that benefits off of drawing 2 cards a turn. I think that Tattoo Dragon isn't quite as good as Acidonis and Crimson Firemaw, but you have a lot of ways of drawing 2 cards. You've got Seek Power, you've got the Emblems, which you're maxing out on, you've got Dragonforge if you're playing that, you've got the Treasure Troves you get off of Kozin Darkheart, and you even have Blazing Salvo if you're playing that for the market. I don't think that's necessary to play a market because, well, Blazing Salvo just has to be able to kill something. There are going to be points in the metagame where the units that matter don't have 2 health and Blazing Salvo isn't good. I think that Blazing Salvo is back to being good, but there was definitely a couple days where I think that Blazing Salvo just wasn't killing anything and wasn't very good. Anyway, I think we're back to being Blazing Salvo being good. In the market, you usually are looking at Double Edict, the Fire and Primal Edict, Backlash to deal with any sort of Shenra Speaks, and Draconic Ire, of course, which is the big one. That one has Bargain, and when you hit an enemy with a dragon, you get to play Draconic Ire from your market, which destroys it just destroys an attachment. I think that the current state of the metagame wants to have Provoke the Dragons in this deck somewhere. You need to be able to close out games quickly because of the clock that Grownup Stranger is putting on you. So Provoke the Dragons especially against a deck like Xenon Strangers, which doesn't generally have a lot of defenses in the air, Provoke the Dragons gets in a lot of damage, and I think that's often necessary, even though I really just do not like the card. But I think we're just in a spot where you do want to have Provoke the Dragons somewhere in your deck. If you are playing Salvo in the market, otherwise you can I've seen lists that max out on Provoke the Dragons, and somehow I don't think that's too wrong right now. Now, of course, Skycrag isn't the only version of dragons. You've got Menace Dragons, which is the 3 faction, and you've got Stone Scar Dragons. I think the big draw to those decks is Vorprex's Choice, which is the 2-cost Fire Shadow card that says choose one, an opponent sacrifices a unit or draw a dragon or weapon from your void. That card is very good. It's a good answer to Grownup Stranger. It's a good way of recurring threats against control decks. I think that's the reason if you're not playing Skycrag Dragons, I think that Vorprex's Choice is the card that you want and the card that you should be maxing out on. As far as what you get from being Menace Dragons, I guess you also get access to some market cards. You could play Aramot's Designs in the market, which I don't think is too good. You can have Display of Menace, which again, in the right metagame, it can be very good. It's very good against Armory. It gets to kill a relic and give all relics voidbound, and Armory is a deck that really relies on recurring those weapons. So, it definitely has uses, but I don't think that that's going to be... I think the consistency is just going to be the important part in this metagame when you're against decks like Unseen and Strangers, which just have a really, linear game plan. You need to be able to compete with that, and if you're just dirtling around too much, then I think you're going to be in a lot of trouble. So, there's also, Skylord Tolek, which is kind of just Provoke the Dragons, and yeah, I'm really not a fan of the 3-faction version. I think that if you are playing straight Stone Scar that has some interesting upsides, you get Vile Collaborator, which I suppose is a little questionable. Even a 4/4 on the ground might not be worth that much right now, but you have a good power base and you get access to Vorprex's Choice and you get access to all the fire dragons. I mean, Crimson Firemaw and Tattoo Dragon are both excellent. You probably don't play Cinderclutch in that deck. I think it's more of a Dragonforge deck because you can search up Carve It, and Carve It does a nice job of stabilizing against aggro decks. Yes, I just did say that Carve It works well in a deck. Anyway, yeah, so I think that Dragons is the third big deck in the format. You have a few options for which version you're playing. I think straight Skycrag is just the best version. You get to max out on emblems, which is good for your consistency, and you just have all the tools that you need when you play Skycrag. And one more note, I think that Permafrost is really good right now. I know that people talk about being able to blow out Permafrost with Wind Conjuring from the Unseen market, but I still think that Permafrost is very worth running, and I think it's very good against Xenon. I think it's good against Dragons. I think that if you're playing a Dragons deck, you should probably play Permafrost. All right, let's just briefly talk about some of the other decks that might show up in the tournament. You've got Rakano Aggro, which I was really high on last week, and I think I would still be high on it if it weren't for how good and how consistent Xenon Strangers is. You've got some Armory decks, which they can be really good. Sometimes they just work perfectly. They get the Rakano Artisan that buffs all their weapons in their deck, and they get a Dragon Forge. They play a Daisho early. It's a 5/5. They kill 2 things. They recur it with Strange Blacksmith. There's a lot of appeal to playing Armory, but there's also a big issue in that if you draw 0 weapons, you're really unhappy, and if you draw 3 or more weapons, you're also really unhappy, because when you have multiple weapons in your hand, only the first one does anything. I mean, sure, it's going to break at some point and then you have a backup, but it severely limits the amount of choices that you can make. And I think that just leads to the deck being a little more inconsistent than I would like. If someone figures out the magic formula of how many relic weapons they should play and how many other cards and supporting cards, I think that has the potential to be a really strong deck going into this weekend, but I couldn't make it work. did work on it quite a bit. I splashed Shadow, I splashed Time for Shenron Speaks. I tried a bunch of other things with it, and I wasn't ever quite happy with it. You might also see 3-faction control decks. I think that they're generally not very good. These are Shenron Speaks decks. You probably want to play Shenron Speaks, Justice, and Time. And I've seen some that play Primal, and I've seen some that play Fire. They're basically what you'd expect to have control decks in Eternal. They draw a lot of cards, they sweep the board. I don't think that they're what you want to be doing in this metagame. I mean, the Unseen have a bunch of Aegis that works pretty well, or they can get Aegis at least, that is pretty resilient to sweepers, and then the Dragon's deck has Charge out of Eclipse Dragon, and heaven forbid the 5/2 that has Charge for 6. The name is escaping me right now. And if you face against an Armory deck, then all of your removal is generally pretty unhappy because you just can't deal with the relic weapons that they're beating you in the face with. So, like, I really don't think that a control deck is a good idea into this metagame. There could be, as of yet, undiscovered decks that do well into this metagame. I've seen some people playing Praxis, but I don't really understand why you would play Praxis over Xenon. It feels like your removal is just worse, and you get a few cool cards like Ramba, but it just doesn't seem worth it. Strange Gladiator, I think. It's the 3/3 that buffs cards in hand. So there are some cool cards there, but I just don't think it's doing anything better than the Xenon deck. I've seen, Elysian Flyers, I should mention that. I think that Elysian Flyers was really good when the decks were just like really not streamlined, so you could just beat them in the air with 1/1s. And I think that decks are just like faster and more efficient now, so that's not quite as good of a strategy. Plus, it's probably really bad against Unseen. So I don't think that Elysian Flyers is going to win this tournament as well. But I mean, hey, it won the tournament 2 weeks ago, so I guess I shouldn't count it out. I've seen some mid-range Elysian decks, and again, like mid-range Time decks, I think that they probably just want to be playing Xenon because you get access to Banish, which is one of the best removal spells in the format. Speaking of which, let's talk about I think the 3 pillars of the format. Not only are they the big parts of the 3 main decks that I outlined earlier, but I think they're really what's keeping other decks from entering the metagame. And they are the 3 removal spells: Banish, which is destroy a unit or relic of 5 cost or less; Sear, which is the 2 cost, deal 3 damage to something out of fire; and then there is Fall Short off of Master's Blade. Particularly Master's Blade, because that card also adds a ton of power. It's kind of like Spell Shaper. If you haven't yet seen Master's Blade in action, it's almost like Sodi's Spell Shaper, where it kills something and adds a huge threat to the board. So I think that those are the 3 pillars of the format. They're really constricting what can see play and what can be a viable threat. Because if it dies to one of those cards, I think that it's not going to work out. I think that if you have this great card, but it dies to Sear and Banish, and it costs 5, and it doesn't get any value, I don't think that's going to work out in this format. I think those are the cards that make the decks that are good, they're part of what makes the decks that are good very, very good. If you are bringing a brew to the tournament, I really think that you want to be on the lookout for those 3 cards and make sure, okay, is this card good against these 3 cards? Banish and Sear helps push out relic weapons because they hit relic weapons, and Master's Blade hits a lot of units. You have to have a unit that has battle skills if you want to stick around against Unseen. And, well, Banish just hits a lot of units too. So does Sear. Sear kills almost everything that costs 2 or 3 in the format. Anyway, those are the cards that I think you should be watching out for if you are trying to bring your own brew to the tournament. All right, that's about all I have to say for this format. Again, I think I'm probably going to be bringing Argenport Unseen. And if you want to look at these deck lists that I've been working with, I'll definitely have links to them in the description. I hope you enjoyed this. Good luck to everyone battling this weekend. Hopefully I'll see you on Sunday. Thanks again to our patrons for supporting FECast and Friends of Eternal. And thank you for listening. I hope you enjoy FECast and continue to listen to it, and tell a friend about it if they're interested in Eternal tournaments or just keeping up to date with all the news with Eternal. All right, next week we should be back to having a full house, hopefully. I mean, the week before in ECQ, a lot of people that normally are on this cast are pretty hush-hush about what decks they're playing. I don't even know what they're playing. But I'm excited to see what everyone brings. And yeah, I guess it's only a matter of time. Tournament starts in, 8 hours now? All right. Gotta get to bed and get ready for it. All right. Thanks for listening again. Until next time, I'll see you in the friend zone. Friends of Eternal is awesome, but you know what's even more awesome? Our amazing patrons over at patreon.com. That's right, Friends of Eternal now has a Patreon where you can help support the content and initiatives of Friends of Eternal. If you enjoy FECast and you enjoy the Piloting Club and you want to join the people that make all this possible and sustainable, be sure to head over to patreon.com/friendsofeternal and consider donating. Every little bit does help. Thanks again for listening, and I'll see you next time on FECast.